Thanks for the introduction, Madusha. So hello, I'm Nick Deakin, or you can call me Nick. Hopefully you can see the screen I'm presenting, which is on the title screen right now. So I am a software developer at Google, as Madusha said. That said, the views in this presentation are my own. I'm not saying this on behalf of Google. And with that, so why might you care what I have to say on the topic of cracking the coding interview? Um, so I've, for a little bit of background on kind of where I come from and what experiences I've had that have led me to the advice and conclusions I'm going to be telling you about today. I attended the University of Waterloo and graduated with a nanotechnology engineering degree in 2015. And I was fortunate to get to do a lot of really great co-op placements, or also called, basically an internship, for those of you more familiar with that wording. After graduating, I stayed in Waterloo and worked at a place called Kaleidoscape as a software engineer, where I worked mostly on secure media playback for embedded devices. And I started working at Google on Stadia in the summer of 2018. My time while I've been working at Google, I've been working on graphics tools for developers of the platform. And probably the most important thing on this slide is I've been an interviewer at both Kaleidoscape and Google. So I've sat on both sides of an interview table and have at least a little bit of experience, with this subject. So what is the purpose of this presentation? I want to provide information on what a technical coding interview looks like for those of you who might not have done one before or might be less experienced with them. I'm going to provide my advice on how you might prepare for these interviews, how I like to think about performing in an interview, and I'll give just a little bit of my thoughts on the interview process at Google. And in general, I hope that this information will help you feel more confident in your interviews and land that job you really want. So let's start with what to expect in a technical interview. What is this thing that we're talking about in this session? So if you've interviewed for software development positions before, you probably already know this, but the most common type of technical interview is a coding interview. So the interviewer might ask you a bit about you or your resume, but the bulk of the interview will probably be dedicated to them giving you some programming related problem and asking you to try and solve it using real code on paper or a whiteboard. Examples of what these kind of programming questions can look like are things like reverse a linked list, maybe determine if a particular element is present in a tree, or find the longest palindromic substring in an input string. I think it's worth mentioning, though, while we're on this, that there can be more to a technical interview than just this kind of programming challenge. So for example, as I mentioned before, interviewers might ask you about projects on your resume. And they would do this because they want to see that you actually understood the things that you were working on. And that could be the case whether it was actual work you were doing as an internship or in a full-time position, or even for a school group project or something like that. For more senior students, if you're interviewing for internships or if you're interviewing for full-time positions, interviewers may also want to test other skills beyond kind of basic coding competency. And this would usually include things like your design, testing, or debugging skills. And these can commonly be full interviews in of themselves when it comes to full-time positions. So examples of these kind of questions might be something like asking you to design an API for a thing based on some arbitrary requirements. You might be asked to create a test plan or test method for a thing, or you might be given a broken program and asked to try and diagnose it. All these examples are actual problems I've been asked in full-time interviews. So while we're on the topic of what is a technical interview, I also want to touch on what I think is one of the most important parts here, and that's that the interviewer has goals too. And I think, if you want to try and do well in this situation, you need to understand what the person you're trying to impress is trying to get out of it. So based on my experiences, I think interviewers are generally trying to answer a few particular questions to decide who would be the best fit for their team to try and solve some type of problem. So usually these things they're trying to get answers to are, do you know how to write code? Do you have a good understanding of data structures and algorithms? Do you communicate effectively, in particular about technical stuff? Do you have a good problem-solving strategy? Do you pay attention to details? And perhaps most importantly, would you drive me crazy if we work together every day? Because that, is hopefully the outcome from all this is, the interviewer is looking for a coworker, really. So I think these are important things to keep in mind as you're trying to do well in an interview and impress the interviewer and convince them that you're the right person for the job. So now that we've covered the basics of what is this kind of technical interview, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I like to try and prepare for interviews and my tips for that part of it. The most important thing by far, in my opinion, is practice writing code. And I don't mean just like, over the course of the day, write an algorithm, that does some sort. You need to try and simulate the circumstances that you're going to be in when you're actually in the interview. So I'd recommend giving yourself a question and a time limit and try and write a solution on paper or whiteboard, not in an IDE, and try and do it within the time limit. To help facilitate this, I highly recommend the book Cracking the Coding Interview. It's a great book for practice questions, and for me at least, it felt easily worth the time it saved scouring the internet for good practice problems. In addition to practicing writing code, in particular without an IDE, but rather on a whiteboard or paper, also study your data structures and algorithms, and I would recommend especially the ones that you're less comfortable with. I would also recommend practicing coding on a computer a bit to complement practicing on paper or whiteboard, or even, these days, virtual interviews are probably going to be very common. And so practicing writing in an open Google Doc, which I'll kind of show a little bit later, is also not a bad idea. But actually practice in an IDE as well. And I suggest this because you want to feel good writing in the language you're going to be using in the interview. So you want to feel confident that you're going to be writing decent code without the IDE. And sometimes, practicing with the IDE can be helpful towards that goal. And then the last thing I would suggest is study subject matter at least a little bit. This, starts off very simply with knowing what the interviewer's company does. They may ask you, and the job posting will likely say, so there's not really a good excuse to not have an answer to this question. And if the job posting doesn't say, you can Google it or look it up online. It's pretty easy to get answers to these questions in most cases today. Additionally, if the position is specialized in some way, make sure you're not too rusty on whatever that specialization is. Last that I'll touch on for this kind of note of practicing, I created a repository for myself for studying a few years ago. And I mention it mostly because there's a particular file in there, this docs list of data structures and algorithms. And so this is really just like a big list of text I put together while figuring out what are all the data structures and algorithms I would ideally like to know in an interview situation. And I want to point out that, so that repository is public. If you follow the link gitlab.com/ndeakin/study, you can find this file at docs/list of data structures and algorithms.txt. But I don't think the useful lesson here is, okay, go study this document and you're going to be perfectly ready for interviews. For me, I found the useful part was making the document. And so I would suggest taking the time to go through perhaps your data structures and algorithms textbook and make a similar list for yourself is a really great way to learn the material, and then have a list of things to review after that first pass. So another thing two more things I want to mention about this. One is, I have never known everything that's in this document at once. So if your first thought when you see this is, holy crap, this guy must be a genius, how does he know all of this? I don't. So don't try and strive for that. My thinking is more just trying to know as much of it as I can. And another thing I'll point out is that you'll notice about half of this file is trees. That's because their data structure I haven't found I use a lot in my actual work, but seem to come up a fair amount in interviews. So it's something I want to practice more than most other things. And so for you, it may be something different. Maybe it's matrices are the thing that you feel a little less comfortable with, but want to be ready for an interview question about. Then maybe that's where you'll spend more of your time reviewing. So on the note of preparing for an interview, let's talk a little bit about what to bring and where to an interview. My checklist for what to bring includes pens, at least two, the thinking being one for myself and perhaps one for the interviewer in case they forgot one. I'll bring a couple sheets of paper, and this would be for either writing down things I want to take out of the interview. For example, if I ask questions like, what are the pay? What is the pay? Or would I have to relocate? Or things of that nature. And it can also be useful to write something down to ask later, perhaps at the end of the interview, if you want to leave a note for yourself. I'll also bring a few copies of my resume, ideally enough for each interviewer and myself in case they've forgotten theirs or maybe didn't intend to bring it, but you want to show them something, whatever. I think it's always a good idea to have a couple copies. And to keep all this in, I usually like to have a nice business binder sort of thing, as you see pictured in the top right. And this just makes it easier to carry this stuff around and looks kind of nice. As for what to wear, a suit is always a safe choice. I say that because I think it's always safer to be overdressed than underdressed if you aren't sure. So as an example, if prior to the interview you're told that you can dress casually, that's great. But if you show up in jeans and a t-shirt and their idea of casual was khakis and a dress shirt, you're going to feel a little silly. And so that's why I would always recommend overdressing is much better than underdressing. Even if you show up to that interview in a suit, they're not going to look at you too funnily for that, I would think. So on that note, even if the interviewer says you can dress casually, I recommend dressing up a little. And this also comes down to the fact that you want to put your best foot forward. You want to show them, the most professional you can be, what you're going to bring to that work environment. And, someone who can be confident and look the part of the role they want goes a long ways, I think. And for what it's worth, when I interview now, I usually wear a polo or a dress shirt tucked into some pants that aren't jeans. And in my experiences, at least, that usually has me feeling comfortable in the interview situation because I'm not wearing a suit while the interviewer is wearing a t-shirt, but I'm also not wearing a t-shirt while the interviewer is perhaps dressed up a little. And last but not least, on preparing for the interview, make sure you turn your phone to silent because I promise neither you or the interviewer want your phone going off in the interview. Last but not least, for real, practice solving coding interview questions. Reading solutions is not going to give you the practice you need at solving problems. Transcribing solutions isn't going to do it. This is one of those things that really does come with practice, I think. And so I highly recommend really put in the time practicing solving coding interview questions. So now that we've talked about how to prepare for an interview, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I like to think during an interview to try and ensure it all goes as well as possible. So I'm going to talk a lot about the start of the interview because I think that's one of the most important parts. And that's because in my experience, this plays a big role in how I spend the rest of the interview time. So after I'm given the question by the interviewer, I will usually start by asking myself a few questions. One is, do I actually understand the question the interviewer has given me? And if I don't understand, I'll ask questions until I do, because I can't try and solve a problem I don't understand. And a good way I find to kind of confirm that I have the correct understanding of the problem is I'll try to restate the problem as I understand it to the interviewer. And pro tip, this is good not just for interviews, but just for communication in general to make sure you're on the same page as someone. After I think I understand the kind of general basis of the question, I'll make sure I understand the inputs, outputs, and constraints of the problem. So this might be things like, are there edge cases I do or don't need to worry about? Do I need to worry about a null input, an empty input, and an arbitrarily large input? Is there some sort of upper limit on the size of the input? Things like this can definitely give you an edge if you ask the right questions. And we'll also help you make sure you really, truly do understand the problem and you understand all of what you need to consider for your solution. So at that point, if 1 and 2 are covered, I'm pretty confident I understand what's being asked of me. And now it's time to try and actually solve it. And usually I will start by thinking of the dumb way to solve the problem, or like, what is the brute force way to do it? Just the most straightforward way that would be, in theory, easy to code. And then, if I'm assuming I figure that out, I'll then move on to spend a minute or two thinking, okay, is there some way that's better than the dumb way? Is there a smarter way to do this? That said, I don't think it's worth wasting more than a few minutes on that at this point in the interview, because it's really important to at least get something written down to illustrate to the interviewer you have some, abilities in the areas they're looking for. And if you don't write anything because you're trying to find the perfect solution, you're not going to show them that. Or you might not if you don't figure it out. So you don't want to waste too much time trying to figure out the ideal way to do it. So one really important thing to touch on at the bottom of the slide you'll see is I try and focus on explaining my thought process to the interviewer the whole time. And I almost always end up asking at least a couple questions of the interviewer to clarify the problem. And I try and explain the thought process because they can't read your thoughts. So if you don't tell the interviewer what you're thinking, they don't know what you're thinking. And a big part of it for the interviewer, in my experience, is that they are trying to understand what you're thinking and how you're going about solving a problem. Because I think in a lot of cases, that's what the interviewer is trying to do. They want to find someone who can solve the problems they have to solve. So now that I think I understand the solution, I would get to work actually writing up the solution. So I would start with whatever solution I'm confident I can actually implement, even if it's some brute force solution that I don't feel good about. And I see your question, Rishab. We'll come to the questions at the end just to try and keep things a little easier to manage. So I'm not ignoring you, but we'll come back to that later. So I'll start with whatever solution I can implement. And again, I'll make a conscious effort to talk the interviewer through my thought process, including why I'm writing the code I'm writing. Again, because I'm not going to be taking time to write comments on code in an interview. Interviewers don't expect that in my experience. And so I kind of use my talking through the interview as the comments, albeit very verbose comments, but still. Also, one small thing I'll mention is make an effort to pick somewhat effective variable names. I'm not saying as an interview or as someone on the other side of the interview table evaluating someone interviewing, I'm not going to expect you to have the perfect variable names every time. You've got a very limited amount of time, and that's just not the most valuable thing to do with it. But it's nice to see slightly thoughtful names opposed to A, B, C, D, etc., because I don't want to work with the person who thinks that that's a great idea. And it's also okay to refactor as you write, as you go. If something could be a little better, or you realize it's going to make the rest of what you're going to write a lot easier. On the flip side, though, you only want to spend so much time writing, so you don't really want to spend time rewriting a whole bunch. And so it's okay to add arrows or other shortcuts for illustrating updates. Every interviewer has done this. If you're writing on a whiteboard, we know you can't just insert a new line. So, adding arrows to show, another line was added or something, in my experience, I think is pretty acceptable and usually worthwhile. And last but not least, on kind of the step, kind of what goes through my head while I'm writing my solution, I'll try and take a moment every now and then to look at the bigger picture and confirm that things are fitting together in my solution like I imagined when I started. And this is hopefully much like you would do as you're writing, any code, really. So before finishing up entirely, I'll always reread my solution, and I'll try and be a little more nitpicky this time. I'll look more carefully at things like, did I verify my input to an acceptable degree? Do I have the right range on all of my loops? Did I handle those, whatever edge cases might have come up? I'll also try and walk the interviewer through an example or two. And I do this for two reasons. One, it helps me convince myself that it's right. And it also helps convince the interviewer that your solution's right. And so I'll walk through simpler examples at first. So things like, what if the input is null? Maybe what if the input is empty? Assuming these are inputs you need to worry about. And then usually I'll go on to a simple example that was provided by an actual sane person and kind of walk through the code and illustrate that it seems to do the thing we intended it to do. After that, if I haven't already, I would determine the time and space complexity of my solution and tell the interviewer why what I'm telling them is the case. Why do I think it's this time and space complexity? And also I'll usually add if I think it's good or not. If it's some, end of the 7 solution, whatever, I might say something like, I feel like there's a better way to do this, but this is the best I can do in this time constraint. So there we go. And this is good just to give them the sense that you have some, I think, you can think critically about these things. And in a real world situation at your work, you might implement something and it might be performant or not, but having some sort of ability to reason about whether it's as good as it could be is very valuable. And then after all that, if there is more time, maybe you can improve on your solution. If you got that kind of not so good solution and you think it could be better and there's time, I might mention to my interviewer, I think it could be a little better if I do this. Do you think we have time for me to try and improve it? And depending on the time left in the interview, they might be happy for you to give that a shot. So, a lot of what I've said so far is assuming a best case scenario where everything goes well. I'll talk a little bit now about how I try and avoid or fix bad situations. And the number one thing here is do prepare and practice. If you've prepared for your interview well, then hopefully, there won't be too many bumps. Another really important thing on the note of preparation is be honest in your resume. If you lie about knowing how to code in a certain language or having some technical competency, they're probably going to find out very quickly in the interview, and it's going to be pretty awkward. Similarly, be ready to write code in an acceptable language. If you know what the interviewer expects beforehand, perhaps because they're hiring specifically for, let's say, a C++ development position, you better be ready to write C++ because there's not going to be a lot of wiggle room. That's what you're going to have to use because that's what they're going to need you to use on the job. And if in some scenarios, though, it's a little less specific what the role language might be. And in this case, the interviewer might suggest a language. And if this is the case and they suggest a language that you don't know very well, I would always suggest asking if an alternative is okay. So as an example, there have been times when I've interviewed someone and I was under the impression all of our candidates were going to be able to write C. And, one of them said, I'm not very familiar with C. Do you mind if I use Python? And I said, of course, I understand it enough to know what you mean. And for you to be able to show me the best of your abilities is more important in that scenario than you showing me you know how to write C. So it's always worth asking. But as I mentioned before, if you know what the position is for and it's a specific language, they might require you to use that language. Moving on, be honest with the interviewer and tell them if you don't understand the problem. This shows communication and problem solving skills and might lead into asking more questions and understanding the problem. If you pretend like you know what they're asking you and you really don't, it's probably not going to go very well. So it's, in my experience, never a bad thing to say, look, I just don't understand what you mean. Can you please, this is a good opportunity for trying to reiterate in my own words what I think they're trying to ask, and they might be able to help, fix your understanding. And similarly, don't be afraid to spitball ideas when getting started. Some interviewers, in my experience, kind of aim to be a little more involved and expect that it's a tough question. And so you're going to ask some questions, maybe say some ideas. And I will definitely do this personally if I don't really know what way I should go. And, some interviewers are happy to give small hints, and this isn't, that can be a good thing. So don't get caught up on figuring out the ideal solution. And as I alluded to before, I think it's always better to write a bad solution and try to improve it later than to write nothing at all. I made some comment about an n to the 7th solution earlier. I actually wrote one for one of my Google interviews that got me hired. And I think in that case, there probably was a better way, but I think it was also just a hard problem. And sometimes that's going to be the case. So that's, based on my personal experiences, one of the main reasons I don't try too hard to find the ideal solution, because sometimes your idea of what ideal might be is also just too, I don't know, maybe too ideal. Last but not least, it doesn't always go perfectly, and that's okay. I definitely didn't get hired my first time interviewing at Google, not to speak of the number of times I sent my resume and didn't get an interview. So I think it's really important to keep in mind that every interview, especially one you think went poorly, is the lesson as well. And there will be other opportunities, and at that company or otherwise, to get that job. So don't stress out too much about a bad interview. Okay. Now I'm going to do a quick example of how I might go about solving a problem. So this is a question suggested a while back to me. So I'll give some I guess full disclosure that I have attempted this problem a couple times in the last couple months, so I have some idea of what I'm about to be asked, but I'm still gonna wing this or do my best to wing it, given I've practiced it already. But anyway, we'll see how it goes. So this is a question from LeetCode. This is like a pretty good, I think, good example of what some entry level like internship questions might look like. If you're interviewing for full-time positions, this might be more like a phone interview question that they use for screening. So some background for this question, a palindrome is a string that reads the same forwards or backwards. And so the actual question is, given an input string S, return the longest palindromic substring. So I am going to go to a little workbook I've got set up here. And this is probably going to be pretty similar to what a lot of interviews might look like if you're having interviews in our current times, is you might be writing in some shared Google Doc or something like that. So I'm going to give an attempt to solve this, hopefully kind of quickly. No, excuse me. And we'll see how it goes. So I'm going to try my best to follow my own advice. So I'd start by asking myself, do I understand the question? So given the input string S, find the longest palindromic substring. So the interviewer, myself, explained to me what a palindrome is. That's good. That's a key starting point to understand this problem. I'm familiar with the idea of a substring. So in my, I might mention to the interviewer, so I think what you want me to do is you're going to give me this input string S, and you want me to find the longest palindrome within it. And they would say yes, because they're me in this case. So I might then ask some questions about input and output, like what happens in edge cases. So I might ask something like, do I need to worry about a null input? Or what about an empty string? And in this case, a pretty reasonable answer would be, yes, you do need to worry about these things. And I might say, okay, in the case where no palindrome is found, what do you expect is the output? And in this sort of question, a lot of time, and what should happen in error case X is really entirely up to the discretion of the interviewer. They could say, I want you to return, the string pony. In this case, I'm going to say, I want you to return null, if nothing's found, or on any kind of erroneous input. I say, okay, great. So I've got, I think, a pretty good understanding of my input and my output. I guess, I might also ask for for input. Is there any kind of cap on the length of the string? And, if I'm an interviewer, maybe I say, no, but you don't need to worry about it being too long for the memory on your system. Okay, great. So now I think I've got a pretty good idea. So I'm going to start writing out the code, and I'd be, at this point, I probably would have mainly just confirmed with the interviewer that I understand the question. I've asked some questions about the input and output. By the way, if I'm looking a little bit away from the camera, that's just because of where my keyboard is and other monitor. But anyway, so I'm going to think to myself, okay, or if I'm talking to the interviewer through this, I'd say, okay, well, I'm going to start with verifying my input. So I'm going to say if S is equal to null, then I'm going to return null, since that's what we do in a kind of invalid input scenario. Now I might think to myself, okay, I want to use strlen to get the length of a string. I might ask the interviewer, is it okay if I use, built-in C++ functions to get the length of the string? And they'll probably tell you yes, because, if you can figure out the rest of this problem, you probably know how to figure out the length of a string without built-in functions. So let's say, okay, great. I'm going to store the length because I think I'll probably need it a few more times. It's a bit of an optimization, but I think it's just going to make for shorter code later. So I'm going to say int length equals strlen s. So I'm getting the length, because if the length is 0 or 1, actually at this point I might ask, do you consider a string length 1 a palindrome? And because that could be something that's up for debate potentially. I'm not super familiar with palindromes, so I would definitely clarify that. And in this case, the interviewer might say, yeah, and a palindrome counts if the length of the string is 1. So you say, okay, if length is less than or equal to 0, then I'm going to return null, because there can't be a palindrome in it. And if length is 1, then we can just return the string we were given. And just to be consistent, I'll keep my style good. And so notice, for example, for length, I didn't use length. I used lang, but I think that's pretty acceptable. I didn't use a or b or xyz, so I don't feel too bad about that. Okay, so at this point, we've handled a bunch of our kind of weird edge cases, and now it's time to figure out how to actually find palindromic substring. So at this point, I would kind of walk the interviewer through how I'm thinking of tackling really the meat of the problem here. And so I would say, okay, my thinking of the kind of the most straightforward way to do this is, basically we need to iterate over a bunch of different start and end positions in the string and see if it's a palindrome. And so, the most obvious way to start is the entire string a palindrome? Because you need to start with the longest part, because the question was to return the longest palindromic substring, not any palindromic substring. So I would say, okay, so I could imagine starting with, let's say, a start index that's the start of the string, an end index that's the end of the string, and kind of working in to see, is it a palindrome from the beginning to end? If not, then maybe I try using the second last character as the end and see if that matches the first one, and so on and so forth. And so through this kind of mechanism, I'm hoping maybe I can figure out, it might not be efficient, but this will get the job done. So I'm gonna start trying to write this up. So my start will be equal to the start of the string. My end will be equal to length minus 1, because I want to get the index of the last character. And then I'm going to have a few loops. So I'm going to say, we've already initialized start. So I'm going to say for start is less than length. So this is going to be the loop to kind of continually iterate over a start index that's later in the string. And then let's say end is greater than start. Actually, I anticipate I'm also going to need something else, which is a way to detect when a palindrome is found within this loop. So I'm going to create this pal found variable. It's a Boolean and it's false. And I'm going to add that to my loops here. Okay, so right now I've got a start index continually moving from the front to the back. And within that, I've got an end index moving from the back to the start. And so now we're going to do one more loop, at least for a starting point of an answer to this question. And so this one is going to actually go over all of the indices for each of these start and end indexes and see if it is a palindrome. So I'm just going to write this up, and then I'll kind of go through an example. So, oh, and I should have mentioned this long ago, but I am using C++ because that is the language I am most comfortable with by far. So anyway, we'll do. So actually, I is going to start at start. J is going to start at end. And we'll loop while I is less than J. Oh, I just realized this should be palindrome not found. And then I is less than J, not found. Actually, that shouldn't be necessary. We'll just do that, and then plus I minus j. Okay. No, that's not what I wanted. Okay. So in this loop, we've got basically, we've got our potential start and end index for the palindrome. I and j are basically going to walk from either end of the potential substring towards the middle, and we're going to see if it is actually a palindrome. So if, let's see here, si isn't equal to sj, then it's, it's not a palindrome. So at this point, we would break out of the for loop here and try a different end index. Otherwise, okay, otherwise, if I is equal to j, I'm thinking, okay, how do we know if we're actually done? So this would be if I equal to j or I plus 1 is equal to j, because in an even length palindrome, I and j are going to be one off at the last comparison we want to do. And in an odd length palindrome, I will be equal to j, which means we've got to the middle character, and the middle character has to be equal to itself. So basically, I'm detecting if we're at the last one and s at both I and j matches, then we don't want to continue. We can say pal found equals true. And we can throw in a break. So now at the end here, okay, so I'm going to take a step back at this point to see if what I've thought of is working well. So let's try we'll try two simple examples right now. I'll try the string AB. So input 1, AB, and then I'll try input 2, ABA. Actually, even simpler, we'll just do AA. So AB should return, yeah, we'll do a theoretical finish. So if pal found, then, well, if not pal found, we'll return null, because that's what we're supposed to do in that case. Okay, great. So if it's not found, return null. Otherwise, okay, now I might ask the interviewer, oh, do I need to return a newly allocated string, or can I modify the input? And in this case, since I get to make the choice, I'm going to say, well, since you can modify the input, you may. Oh, actually, oh, no, there we go. Now I can modify the input. Perfect. So yeah, to make things a little easier for myself, I'm going to allow myself to modify the input. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace the, I'm going to make sure the character after the end character is a null terminator, which I may have double checked to say it's a null terminated string, right? And hopefully it is. And then I'll return. And here I'll actually return basically the index at which the palindrome starts. So this is just a cute trick to not need to reallocate a string. So, okay. So with the finish done, so let's try input 1, AB. So we'll go through, at the start is S null. No, it's going to be something where something points to AB. Length of string is going to be 2. 2 is not less than 0, so we won't return null. And 2 is not equal to 1, so we won't return S there. Okay, so start is equal to 0. End is equal to 1 because 2 minus 1 is 1. Pal found is false. Okay, great. So is start less than length? Yes, it is, because start is 0, length is 2. Pal found is false. We're good. Okay. End is equal to 1, not pal found. Okay, great. So basically, we get into this innermost for loop, and I is equal to 0, j is equal to 1. If si doesn't equal sj, which is true because a is not equal to b, I'm going to break because a palindrome wasn't found. And so, okay, we'll go up to this one. End, so minus minus end is now 0. End is no longer greater than start, so we're out of this loop. We'll plus plus start. Start is now 1. Okay, so yeah, actually we do, okay. So this is interesting. I've just noticed that now what I'm going to do is I'm going to try start is, so I've actually noticed 2 bugs in my code here. So the first is that in this one, I should actually do end is greater than equal to start, or maybe I realized that a bigger problem with the answers I received from my interviewer, which is, oh, if a palindrome of length 1 counts, then there's always going to be a palindrome and a valid string. So maybe we clarify that behavior, or maybe they say, okay, you know what, length 1 doesn't count, because that's annoying. So if length 1 doesn't count, then we end up determining that AB is, returns null. Okay, that was all great. I'm not going to make too many more changes because I don't want to spend too much more time on this example because it's only so interesting to watch me try and write code. Okay, so let's try AA. So all these checks are the same because the length is the same. We're going to get to our innermost loop, and I is going to be 0, j is going to be 1, si and sj are now both a, so this isn't true. Else if I equals j, this isn't true, but I plus 1 does equal j. So we mark pal found equals true and break. We won't continue either of these 4 loops because pal found is now true. Pal found is true, so we don't exit here. We set sn plus 1 equal null terminator, which has no effect because it was already the null terminator, since the length end is 1 minus length, and length itself is where the null terminating character is. So we now return start of the string. And so we've got something here that kind of basically works. It definitely doesn't quite work perfectly, but without wasting any more time on that, there's kind of a basic example of what I would think about going through that process. Oh, touching on the ends. So I went through some examples. They asked me for the time and space complexity. So for time, I would say, well, we've got 3 nested for loops. So the easiest guess is it's going to be n to the 3, where n is the string input length. Since, basically n to the whatever, where whatever is the number of for loops, is a pretty good starting point for guessing your time complexity, assuming if it's something with a bunch of loops. As for space complexity, it's O to the 1. We don't, or I guess it's O to the n, but O to the 1 additional memory because we don't need to allocate anything more. And of course, it will take up as much memory as the input takes up. We can't really avoid that. And then I would also add, I think there's probably a smarter, cleverer way to solve this, but in the 20 minutes I wanted to give myself to show you, I did not have more time to figure that out. So great, there we go. The hardest part of this for me is over. So with the example done, I'm gonna basically finish up kind of the me talking at you part. And I'm going to finish up with a little bit about, let me actually present this. So I'm going to finish up with talking a little bit about my thoughts on interviews at Google and just a couple other closing words. So the information I've mentioned so far should be useful for almost any coding interview. But here are just a few things, or a few of my thoughts on Google technical interviews in particular. And the first and foremost thing I have to say on this topic is that there are a lot of really good resources provided online by Google on their interview process. So these are probably more useful than anything I could ever tell you, especially in just a couple minutes on the single slide. So definitely check those out if you're interested in interviewing at Google specifically. That said, I think Google's hiring process, based on my experience, places a lot of value on coding interviews and a lot of value on your problem solving approach and communication in these interviews. I think it's pretty highly subjective around these interview results, and it allows for success even if you don't have a perfect solution, as my aforementioned n to the 7 solution illustrates. And the last thing I'll mention is for those of you who may have interviewed as an intern or gotten an internship at Google or something like that. I think full-time hiring is very similar to intern and co-op interviewing, but it's a little more involved. Usually 4 or 5 in-person interviews and higher expectations around performance in the interview, which makes sense. You're going to get paid a lot more. You're going to have more responsibility. So that's kind of to be expected, I think. And with that said, here are just a few closing words. These are the things that I think are most useful to keep in mind if you remember nothing else from anything I've said over the last almost hour now. First is understand and keep in mind the interviewer's goals. And what this means practically to me is usually make sure you communicate with your interviewer and you tell them what you're thinking. Because if you're just telling them nothing and you're not writing code, then they're just going to think you have no idea what's going on. So at least try and explain to them what's going through your mind, what you're thinking. If you don't know what to do, explain to them why not. This is really, really important, I think, and can make the difference between like a terrible interview and like an okay interview. And if you're interviewing a couple times at one place, then that okay versus terrible interview can make a big difference. Second, practice solving coding problems on paper and a whiteboard. Practice, practice, practice. That is probably the most important thing. And last but not least, you don't need to write the perfect solution. So don't get too caught up on trying to find that ideal, perfect solution to every interview problem you're given. And with that said, thank you for your time. Good luck with your interviews, and hopefully this is you soon if you follow some of these tips. And with that, I think I will give it back to Madhusha, and we'll be able to answer some questions if there are any. Madhusha? So if you don't mind, I'll start with one that was asked in the chat while I was talking. And that one is from Rishabh. His question was, sometimes I'm worried about that the interviewer might think what I'm saying out loud is dumb. Should I still go ahead and talk my thought process? Honestly, yes. I would, no matter
Rishabh,
how.
do you want to ask the question so everybody can hear it?
Oh, yeah, sorry. If Rishabh's here, I'm happy for them to repeat the question. Perhaps, Madhusha, I can just repeat it from the chat here.
Nick, I'm checking to see.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll repeat this one from Rishabh and try. Oh, sure. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good question. And I think my honest answer to that is yes. I would still say what you're thinking, because I think, as much as especially in an interview situation, it's typically, especially if you're a new graduate or looking for an internship, is usually kind of daunting. I've been there. You are very inexperienced at this thing that you're trying to convince them you can do. Meanwhile, they're the professional and person who has perhaps years of experience. And so it's definitely a very relatable concern. My advice would be still talk them through it. because I mean, like the number of times I say dumb things in the day, trying to think out loud to myself, or just like explain to my coworker what the problem is probably almost countless. These, it's, I think working with computers and with technology in general in the way that, a lot of these jobs would require you to question your assumptions, and those start with sometimes asking stupid questions like, is it plugged in? Like that's a stupid question, but sometimes that is really the problem, is it's just not plugged in. And so I would still recommend that even if you're worried it's dumb, let them know, because it's not always dumb, and you might say what you're thinking, and you might be surprised to hear them say, "Oh, that's a really good idea. Why don't you expand on what you mean by that," or something like that. So I would personally, in my experience, I've usually shied away from worrying about that. I just tell them what I'm thinking, and I mean, it's usually you know what, I don't see much point in lying about it, because, or pretending like you know much better than you do, because if you just don't know, well, the code you write is going to be dumb too, right? So I, I think just being honest with your thought process is honestly the best way to success. And if if it doesn't work out well, you'll learn from it, and I think that's also valuable. So yeah, my opinion is it's still worth it to be honest with what you're thinking, even if you're worried it might sound dumb. So I think there's kind of two ways to go about that, in my opinion. I think so. One would be if you want to practice for interviews. I don't think projects in general are that helpful, in the sense that like an interview is not real work. This sounds silly, but my opinion is like interviewers are like entirely fake scenarios where you need to do your best to show that in the system that is currently usually in place for determining if people are competent, can you show them that? And I think working on like a real project is frankly not the most conducive way to prepare for that situation, because real projects are not the same. I would suggest, like I mentioned, practice solving interview questions if you want to prepare for interviews. But I think the flip side of that is a key part of preparing for interviews is having the skills the employer is looking for. And so if you want to practice coding and generally improve your coding ability, don't practice for interviews, practice on some side project. Because solving interview questions doesn't teach you a whole lot about solving real world problems, in my opinion. Um, actually solving problems that you care about is the best way to learn about practical experience, writing software and the problems you're going to run into. So as an example, when leading up to kind of some of my first software related positions, I spent a bunch of time writing this like really silly little like skiing game, because I really like skiing. So I made this little like ski racing game with some gates and a little skier you would control to move through it. And it's nothing impressive, but I learned a lot writing it. And it was a lot easier than like finding, I think before that I'd looked up some like, what are they called? I think it's like Project Euler has a bunch of like math focused problems. And those just didn't really, I don't know, they didn't, I had a harder time relating to those, because you know, solving problems about numbers wasn't something that I really found super interesting to me personally. But for you, if you love math and you love solving problems with numbers, then like something like Project Euler could be a great place to get like practice projects from. So I think the key in my experience is finding something you can be passionate about and you think is actually interesting. And the toughest time is like the first program you write, honestly, because you have very little of the skills to know what you're able to do. Even like making a calculator seemed daunting to me at that point. But I'm pretty sure, if I recall correctly, one of the first programs I made was a calculator, because you've got to start somewhere. So if you don't have anything that you can think of that you can do and is interesting to you, then figuring out some kind of just way to start writing the first line of code is even if it's like writing a calculator. You can probably make a calculator in like any framework or language or system. So that's always a good starter thing, is like make yourself a calculator if you don't know what else to do, and go from there. So hopefully that kind of answers the question, Madhusha. Right. Yeah. So my personal experience, like interviewing and getting hired at Google, if I recall correctly, I'm pretty sure I first applied for like um, internships when I was in university. And I knew it was a long shot, but because I had no software experience, I just figured, what's the harm? And yeah, I didn't hear back that time. No surprise. But I think I maybe applied again around when I was graduating, and at that point, I'd done an internship doing software stuff. But again, I had very little experience, like relative to other people graduating the same year as me. I didn't have high expectations because I knew I was competing with people who would, on paper, look much more strong than me. But I tried because you miss all the shots you don't take, whatever exactly the quote is. So I think uh, it was a couple years later. I think after I'd been working full time as a software developer for about 3 years, I tried applying to Google again, and that time uh, I actually heard back, and they called me in for a phone interview. I did a phone interview, which was something based on the difficulty of my phone interview, I assumed was kind of more of a we don't want to be going further than that with anyone who doesn't actually know how to write code. Kind of like a fizz bang sort of problem. It wasn't exactly that, but it was pretty straightforward. And then I went on to, and Google agreed. They thought I did well enough to justify kind of full on-site interview. And so at that time for me, that involved going onto the into the Google Waterloo office where I currently work, and doing five like 50-minute interviews, all kind of full length technical interviews. And I felt really good about it. Actually, to be honest, I was a little disappointed I didn't get the job when I learned that I didn't, because I thought it went pretty well. I was able to ask the recruiter, what if they could help me understand what I could have done better or where I fell short. And at the time, their answer to me was basically, honestly, like it was very close. You did very well, but it just wasn't quite there. They mentioned specifically in kind of areas for me of I think it was like my design, which looking back I can appreciate, but at the time it did not feel. It felt hard to take action on, and I kind of concluded that a likely scenario was based on my experience, I was in kind of an awkward situation where, I had enough experience that I wasn't really a new grad, but I wasn't up to the level that they'd expect for someone with industry experience. So I kind of thought to myself, okay, I'll try again in a year. Because from what I recall talking to the recruiter, or maybe it was just this information was online, Google's policy, unless it's changed, is that you can basically reapply after a year. So so yeah, I thought to myself, okay, well, I think with experience, I'll get closer, and maybe next time I can, just do that little bit better to get the job. And so I think the year later, I didn't end up applying back to Google. I seriously considered it, but I was in like a pretty good position at the job I had at the time, and was getting a lot of good opportunities, and so I wasn't really ready to think about leaving. But then maybe 6 months after that, I got a call from a recruiter at Google because they were interested in interviewing me for a position that had opened up in the Waterloo office. And I think it was about a year and a half or 2 years after I first interviewed overall. So at that point, I interviewed again, and I I felt kind of similar to the first time, in that I thought it went pretty well, but I wasn't. I think because I thought the first time went really well, I didn't really feel like I knew how it was going to go. But that time I did end up getting the job, and it's been pretty great since. I've really enjoyed working at Google. The almost 2 years now, like a year and 9 months or so.
So
And
let's.
sorry, I should add actually one really important thing for me to add is like I studied so hard for both those interviews I did at Google. Um, Probably even harder for the second one because I knew how hard I studied for the first one that didn't quite do it. Like I studied harder for these than I studied for anything ever in university because it mattered more to me. That's the honest truth for better or for worse. So, it wasn't like I didn't put in effort for one, the first one, but did for the second. I put in quite a bit of effort for both, but I maybe had a better idea of what the goal was for the second one, at least in some sense. Anyway, sorry to interrupt you, Madusha.
So the other question, I don't know, does anybody else have any other questions? Is studying system design helpful for SWE interviews? So we got a question, Nick. Is studying system design helpful for software engineering interviews?
So yeah, that's I think a very good question. I don't have a very good answer for it. My answer is something like this. I think my interviews personally that I had at Google were not very system design focused. So in that context, no. But I have had interviews at other places that, frankly, I was probably not very well prepared for because I hadn't done interviews like them before. I hadn't prepared for them. And, in that scenario, I really wish I would have done it. So I think the short answer is like it depends a lot on the kind of position. If it's a more advanced position, then I think those kind of questions are more common. If it's a more entry level position, I don't think it's worth spending much time on. Like if you are just graduating this year, for example, I would not spend very much time on system design stuff because interviewers will probably be more worried about more fundamental things like data structures and algorithms and coding competency and communication skills.
Thank you for the question. Anybody else got any other questions? Okay, in that case, I have one last question. I know everybody's stuck home.
Sure.
Some was up playing games. Do you want to share what you are working on with the Google at Google?
I can talk just a little bit about it. Yeah. I work. So I think I mentioned I work on graphics tools for developers on the Stadia platform. So what this really, that can be a little bit of a convoluted sentence. So what it really means is you can imagine like if you were a game developer on any platform, whether it's PC, Xbox, Stadia, whatever, if something goes wrong, you need tools to help you understand why. So like if you're developing on PC, you might be used to using Visual Studio, and it provides a lot of tools for you to help debug problems. Now, in particular, I'm trying to help. I work on a team that's responsible for supporting development of graphics stuff for Stadia. So a great example of the sort of work people on my team have done has been adding support for Stadia to the open source graphics debugger RenderDoc. So this kind of allows developers to look at a frame of their game and see what graphics API calls went into generating the frame and to understand where things went wrong such that the result wasn't what they expected. And so these sort of tools are really important for developers to be able to develop on Stadia well. So that's kind of the TLDR of what my kind of focus is at Google. Yeah, no problem.